This is Mike Johnson with the download edition of World Business Report for Thursday, February the 12th. Ukraine gets a roadmap to peace and a multi-billion-dollar international loan.
We are not a third world country. This will be a real economic miracle if Ukraine will manage to establish a peace and implement the necessary reforms.
We'll ask if Ukraine really has turned a corner. Also today, as the clocks tick down to the day when Greece runs out of money, what that might mean for the Greek people.
I don't have money on the bank. More people doesn't have than they have. But the people who have, now they're taking out, because the new government said, okay, if you have so much money and you are rich, you will pay.
How multi-billionaire foreign investors have caused property prices to soar in some of the world's biggest cities.
I'm in the middle of central London, and it's like living in the country sometimes. All you can hear are the birds in the square. But from a safety point of view, if a burglary was taking place, there'd be no one there to observe it.
Plus, the row over in-flight nuts, which led to a jail sentence and raises new questions over South Korea's powerful family-run firms. Is this the turning point for Ukraine, battered for so long by violence and economic crisis? International leaders have signed a ceasefire agreement with pro-Russian rebels in the east, and the International Monetary Fund has announced a $40 billion rescue package for Ukraine to be spread over 4 years. IMF chief Christine Lagarde told reporters that a commitment from the Ukrainian government to tackle corruption had helped make the agreement possible.
It's ambitious, it's not without risk, but we believe that it's a realistic set of macroeconomic framework first and ambitious reforms, but reforms that the authorities feel confident they can deliver. Well, clearly the Ukrainian authorities are demonstrating a determination and a courage to reform like we had never seen.
Christine Lagarde. The point of the loan is to stabilise Ukraine's economy, restore growth and improve living standards. It won't mean an awful lot, though, if the ceasefire due to take effect on Sunday doesn't hold. And Ukrainian ceasefires don't have a great track record when it comes to permanence. I asked the Kiev-based economist Vladimir Dubrovsky how important he thought the IMF loan was for his country.
I think it is vitally important in both purely economic sense and in political sense, because in economic sense it is important because Ukraine is running out of money and the Ukrainian government desperately needs something to support itself. This is a war in our country. The country lost a substantial portion of its industrial potential, and also, to make the things worse, one of the main commodities the Ukraine used to export, the ferrous metals and ferrous ore, is now much cheaper than it used to be a year ago. So Ukraine lost a lot of exports, and therefore it needs some more currency to support its national currency. And also the government cannot collect as much taxes as it used to. And at the same time, we cannot substantially cut the social benefits because it would create a riot. So I think this loan is vitally important economically. It is also vitally important politically because it will press on the Ukrainian government, make him to push the reforms.
Yes, he did say, the Ukrainian Prime Minister did sound a note of caution, didn't he, in response to this loan? He said it demanded what he described as very difficult reforms in return. What sort of reforms?
The most necessary reforms are indeed unpopular, but not for the ordinary people. These are the reforms that are very much unpopular for the lobbyists, for the bureaucrats, for the corrupt officials, and so on. As for example, there are still people that are trying to embezzle the budget, and the vitally needed reforms are those that would prevent it.
But one of the reforms is a demand to cut state spending. Isn't that going to inevitably hurt the Ukrainian people?
It will hurt a part of Ukrainian people. It will hurt some thousands of government employees, but it is inevitable because we need to cut the budget. And cutting the government officials does not mean that we necessarily cut teachers or people who provide real services. The most of those cuts are cutting the controlling inspections that used to extort business.
This is only a loan, of course. It's going to have to be paid back. And we've seen with countries like Greece, down the line, they can really struggle with the terms of big loan agreements like this. Do you think the day will ever come when Ukraine can pay this money back?
I think so, because if Ukraine will implement real market reforms and really unleash their entrepreneurial potential, then our human capital, our knowledge, our ability to innovate and so on is on the European level. We are not a third world country. And with this potential, we can grow very fast. This will be a real economic miracle if Ukraine will manage to establish a peace and implement the necessary reforms.
That's a big if, though, isn't it? A key element in securing any recovery, let alone a miracle, is an end to this conflict. Do you think this latest ceasefire agreement will hold?
I strongly hope so. I'm pessimistic about freeing this eastern region of Donbass from the Russian troops and other kinds of militias. But I think that even with the frozen conflict on the east, but a stable frozen conflict, the main problem is that Mr. Putin is the one who is least interested in this development.
You mean Vladimir Putin doesn't want Ukraine to succeed financially?
Yes, he doesn't want Ukraine to succeed in any way because it would be an example for the Russian people. He said that we are the same people, we are the same nation. And if Ukrainians will do it based on the European values, on the democratic values, then what prevents Russians to do the same? So he will do whatever he can to prevent Ukraine from being a successful country.
The Ukrainian economist Vladimir Dubrovsky. Well, Greece is another country badly in need of a little cash right now. European Union leaders have gathered for a summit in Brussels to discuss whether to extend the Greek bailout. Greece's current EU rescue deal expires in just over 2 weeks' time. If no agreement can be found, Greece may quit the euro and return to what would be a virtually worthless drachma. Here's how some people in Athens are feeling about their money.
I don't have much money in the bank to worry about, but I worry more about what's going to be in the situation here. It's going to be hard, but I believe the situation before, that we were going to be always workers with no future. So better for that than what we had before.
We think that in the end they will sign an agreement and everything will be okay.
We can start from zero. Maybe it's better for us. We can start with zero, with drachma and without European Union. Why not?
You're not worried about that?
No, at all. Not even, I think that nobody here is worried about that. Maybe we want that.
Do you worry about your money in the banks? What might happen?
No, I don't have money in the bank. More people doesn't have than they have. But the people who have, now they're taking out, Because the new government said, okay, if you have so much money and you are rich, you will pay now. And you should pay. They should pay, not we who don't have.
Well, the nightmare scenario for Greece and its euro area partners is that the February the 28th date comes and goes with no agreement. That would mean the country running out of money. But what would it mean for the Greek people? I asked the Greek-born British economist Vicky Price.
The Greeks expect there will be some negotiation, some agreement, and they certainly don't want to leave the euro, which is almost a sort of requirement of whichever government is in power. So it will be quite a difficult one to pull through. But if it were to happen, obviously the Greeks will start seeing that they're moving in that direction. And we've already experienced, or the banks have already experienced, an outflow of funds, which started actually in December, before the election, because of course it was obvious it was going to happen, and then accelerated in January. The estimates from the National Bank of Greece are that something like 3 to 6 billion perhaps left in December, and everyone expects that figure to have increased to about 11 billion in January itself, and of course here we are in February. That would inevitably accelerate even further if there is a belief that Greece will leave the euro.
Why? Obvious question, but why? People will be rushing to the cash points to take their money out. Why would they do that?
Anything that's left in the deposits will, of course, lose value hugely should they move from a euro to a drachma.
Because the drachma would just pretty much be a worthless currency.
Value very, very significantly. So the ability to buy any goods that are out there, which of course were priced in euros, they will of course have to be repriced, but nevertheless their cost would be quite significant. So anything they can buy from abroad will be much more expensive. So basically they will lose hugely in terms of purchasing power just overnight. Businesses as well, of course, will have the same sort of feeling too of sort of losing the ability to pay for any imports. The interesting thing, of course, for businesses is that what they owe may come down in value very significantly, of course, if it does get translated into drachmas. Huge uncertainty there as to whether that will be the case. But even more important than all that is the belief that probably the banks will not be viable concerns in the future if suddenly quite a lot of what they have as assets are sort of reduced in value very significantly. And that will be a serious, serious problem. What do you do with those banks? And people will probably think, if they can, they'll go to banks which are registered somewhere else. And the government will obviously have to do something quite drastic, such as imposing capital controls.
Right, try to stop money leaving the country, try to stop people taking the money out of the banks.
Which is what we've seen happening in Cyprus, of course, which is still in the euro, but strangely has capital controls. And of course the interesting thing in Cyprus is that as part of the bailout deal, but of course we're talking about Greece exiting without a bailout deal, but as part of the bailout deal in Cyprus, both individuals and companies which had over a certain amount in their accounts suffered a haircut themselves. So that was, and of course you can't distinguish individuals and companies very easily in countries like Cyprus because there are loads of sole traders, but also companies are owned by individuals, families and so on. So there was a serious added pain that the population had to suffer because of that bailout. It's possible that something like that may happen in Greece, but I think the most likely would be quite sort of draconian capital controls.
That was Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor to the British think tank, the Centre for Economics and Business Research. You're listening to World Business Report from the BBC World Service. Still to come on the programme, nut rage.
She then threw a major wobbly, chucked all her toys out the pram.
How one well-connected woman's anger at being served nuts on a plane landed her in trouble. First, though, if you live in one of the world's big cities and you're trying to find somewhere to live, well, you don't need me to tell you what a costly headache that can be. In the last 5 years alone, house prices here in London, for example, have risen by a whopping 50%. A lot of that is down to super-rich foreign investors based in Russia and the Middle East who see places like London as a safe place to stash their cash. They don't always buy property to live in, though. Stephen Sobey has a flat in the affluent Knightsbridge district of London. He told me what it was like there.
Well, I'm the only, in a flat of about 15, in a building, of about 15 flats. I'm the only English person that lives there. But then I'm the only person who really lives in my building permanently. And I think that's true to say of the whole square. If you come back at night, in the evening when it's dark, there are invariably only a dozen lights on in the windows. It is a very empty place where people choose to buy properties that aren't necessary to live in, or if they are, is to live in for a couple of weeks of the year.
And why does it matter that quite a few of the properties around you are empty for a lot of the time?
Don't get me wrong, it's great to have properties that are empty around me some of the time. It's very, very quiet, as I said. You wouldn't know. I'm in the middle of central London, and it's like living in the country sometimes. All you can hear are the birds in the square. But from a safety point of view, if a burglary was taking place, there'd be no one there to observe it. So really, there's no sense of community there because the people who come in are coming in to visit their properties for a few weeks or months of the year. Could be anywhere. They could be in Monaco or Dubai or New York. They're literally coming to take advantage of what London has to offer rather than actually getting involved with the community.
And has this driven up the prices of property, not just in your area, but in surrounding areas too? A lot of this overseas money washing in to London particularly?
Yeah, well, I know of several properties, for instance, in Mayfair, a neighbouring area to mine, where a friend of mine, there are 2 houses on his street that he's never seen anyone coming in or out of in the last 10 years. It is a place where foreign investors will come to park their money. It is the best investment. It is safe, literally, as houses.
So they sit and wait, hopefully, for the property value to rise and rise and rise.
Well, it has to, and it has done. And a lot of people don't even rent them out. It would be a tax liability to rent out these extraordinarily expensive properties. Now, for the ripple effect, I know that my flat has increased by well over 10% in the last year and a half. It's obvious that if people can't afford to live in the centre of town, they will move further and further and further until they can. Even friends of mine who have means, quite considerable means, would not be able to afford to live near to me. And it means that while I'm very happy living there, it does mean you are fairly isolated.
The slightly lonely Knightsbridge resident Stephen Sobey. Well, for another view on whether all of this matters, I turn to the British economist Roger Bootle.
I think there are a number of problems, actually, with this idea of property in your, well, in this case, capital city being held empty by foreigners. In a sense, what this is saying is that one of the things that we can offer, that we're producing, if you like, in our country, is safe haven status for people who want it or need it. But there is a cost to that, and the cost is in terms of the sense of community, or rather the lack of it, the price, the real price of property for your nationals. These are things that you might not find very desirable. Now, of course, when it happens on a small scale, it doesn't matter very much. But if you've got large parts of a city like London being bought up by non-nationals and then kept empty, then this has a major effect upon the nature of your capital city and the way people live in it. And it may well be that if other people around the world want to have that thing you're producing, namely safe haven status, maybe they're going to have to pay for it.
Right, because I was going to ask you what you actually do about this, because you can't very well turn around and say to everybody, look, you can't invest in property only, you've also got to live in it. What do you do about it?
For a start, of course, increasing taxes on property in general would have the side effect of deterring some investment from overseas simply to keep the property empty. So without discriminating against foreigners, you could just do that.
I suppose you could argue, though, that if you put up taxes, that still wouldn't discourage necessarily a super-rich Russian billionaire, say, from investing in a property and leaving it empty. You could argue that they're just too rich to worry about having to pay a little bit more for the privilege of doing that.
I think this is the nature of taxation. This is exactly what happens with regard to taxes on cigarettes, for instance. Do higher taxes stop people from smoking? No. They do raise quite a lot of money for the government, though. The essence of this sort of measure is that it gives people a choice. They're able to say, yes, I want to carry on doing whatever I wanted to do, buying the Knightsbridge penthouse or smoking the cigarettes, but I have to pay an extra price for that to the government.
I suppose you will get people who will make the argument that these wealthy investors can also bring good things with them if they actually come to live in a city. Assuming they pay their taxes, they would help fill government coffers, they might set up business in a big city, they would bring jobs. Do you think there might be a danger we could end up making our big cities less prosperous if we impose more restrictions or higher taxes on property investment?
I have to make this absolutely clear. I don't think there's any sense in Britain deterring, as a matter of policy, foreigners from coming to live here and making business here. I think that would be a disastrous thing to do. We've, I think, gained a lot over the last several years and decades from having people coming from all over the world and either just living here or conducting business here. That's a different thing, though, from the point of holding property empty, either as a speculation or as a safe haven in relation to the domestic difficulties wherever they are in the rest of the world. It's a very different thing, actually. If the result of all this was that we had fewer people from overseas leaving property empty and others either from overseas coming to live here or British people living in the property, I think that would be a result.
That was Roger Bootle, Managing Director of Capital Economics here in London. Well, let's get the very latest from the financial markets now. Kathleen Brooks, Research Director at Forex.com, is with me. Kathleen, there's been a lot of what they call geopolitical uncertainty with what's happening with Ukraine, what's happening with Greece. We've been talking about them in the programme. Let's talk about Ukraine first. On the face of it, good news. Ceasefire, tentative one, but hopefully it will hold, and also this IMF loan.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good news, I think, particularly around the prospect of sanctions that have been put on Russia by the EU, which have really limited the type of trade that European companies can do with Russia, the potential that they may be lifted at some stage. And that's why we've seen a quite strong reaction in the European equity markets today, which was sharply higher this afternoon. Very good news for the luxury sectors, but very good news as well for exporters in places like Spain. We know a lot of food products, food producers were hit very hard by those sanctions. So if they can get lifted, that would be positive news for European equity markets.
And what about Greece? No news one way or the other. These summits, these meetings come and go with not an awful lot of progress at the moment. Is that troubling investors? We've got this deadline a couple of weeks away.
Absolutely not. They are shrugging it off completely. The ECB, European Central Bank, today said that they would lend to extend their emergency lending programme to Greece. And the minute that was announced, you really saw stocks take off. You also saw the euro appreciate. So even though that's just a sticking plaster to the solution to the problems that Greece face, the markets are very happy with short term. The panic is over in the short term.
So they don't see this date as a big thing, a big issue. There's no possibility that this date will come and go, they feel, without some sort of deal being reached.
It doesn't seem like it. And I think the reason why is because actually the closer we get to that date, the more emphasis there will be on reaching a negotiation. In European terms, 2 weeks till the deadline is an absolute age. There's plenty of time for overnight summits for that. So the idea is that the closer we get to the date, the more pressure there will be on both sides to negotiate, and that will force a deal to come through. And I think the markets are seeing it that way. But being very optimistic, which may not be wise at the end of the day, but we'll have to see.
OK, Kathleen, thanks very much indeed. That was Kathleen Brooks, Research Director at Forex.com. Well, after the day's share trading here in London, the main 100 index finished up just 0.5% at 6,828. The Dow in New York, that's also higher. It's up 0.4% at 17,934. Currencies, the euro's up almost a cent against the dollar at $1.14.1. The pound, meanwhile, is trading at $1.53.9. You're listening to the BBC World Service, the world's radio station, and it's good evening to our listeners on 91.9 FM in Spain's Costa del Sol, relayed on Talk Radio Europe. And also good evening to you in Iran on shortwave on 9.505 megahertz. Now, it's the extraordinary episode which became known around the world as nut rage. In December, an airline passenger who didn't like the way her macadamia nuts had been served forced her taxiing Korean airplane back to the gate in New York. Now, Cho Hyun-ah has been sentenced to a year in jail by a South Korean court for violating aviation law. The case has become so much more, though, than just a row over nuts. That's because Cho Hyun-ah was not your average traveller, as I've been hearing from the BBC Steve Evans in Seoul.
She is the daughter of the chairman and chief executive of Korean Air. She was an executive with Korean Air in her own right, in that she was responsible for cabin crew standards. What she did was, on December the 5th, flying from JFK in New York, with the plane not having moved from the gate, she was given a bag of nuts in first class. She took the view that she should have been asked, "Madam, do you want nuts?" And secondly, if she did want nuts, they shouldn't have been served in a bag. She should have had them on either a plate or in a bowl. That is not clear. She then threw a major wobbly, chucked all her toys out the pram, and beckoned one of the cabin staff and poked her with her file, a paper file, not a metal file, I should say, and made people kneel in contrition. She then told the captain of the aircraft to turn back. By this time, the plane had started moving slowly. One of those tug things was pushing it. She then ordered the captain to get the plane put back on the gate so the purser could be ejected. And the captain, thinking, "This is the boss's daughter, I better do what she says," obeyed.
Yeah, and she became a figure of fun around the world for all this, but it's ended in a not terribly funny 1-year jail sentence.
That's right. She's become a laughing stock everywhere, I think it's fair to say. But the authorities in South Korea, perhaps driven by the row and the publicity, took the view that she was liable in law for diverting a flight, and that's a serious offence. Under Korean law, you can get 10 years in prison. So they did her under that. On top of that, the prodding of the member of staff, of the cabin staff, was deemed to be an assault. And on top of that, she was alleged to have put pressure on the cabin staff to change their story. So the book was thrown at her good and proper, but you wonder whether the real penalty is the fact that she will always be known as the woman behind Nut Rage.
and also there's been quite a lot of debate, hasn't there? This case has sparked a debate about how South Korean business and politics are dominated by family-controlled firms like Korean Air.
They are. Something like 3/5 of the GDP of South Korea comes from chaebols, family-owned and run conglomerates. Samsung is the biggest one. Hyundai is another one. The man at the top of Samsung is a very sick man. Is there any debate about who will succeed him? There is not, because it will be his son. Now, family firms exist all over the world. BMW, for example, is a family company. The Kvant family owns it. But the difference is that the owning family in BMW steps back and appoints managers and chief executives who have a track record and who can be got rid of. And that, so the academics say, is a better way of doing business. Now, I hear you say, but, Samsung's doing all right, so what's the fuss? To which the academics reply, some of these big conglomerates are doing very well, but an awful lot of them aren't. And the fact that the boss's daughter is on a plane and feels she owns the plane, and that's the way the judge put it, is not perhaps the best way of doing business.
That was the BBC's Steve Evans in Seoul. Well, don't forget to tune into our sister programme Business Matters at 1 o'clock GMT. It's also available as a breakfast time podcast in Europe, Africa and Asia. But that's all from me, Mike Johnson, and that's all for this Download World Business Report.
You've been listening to World Business Report from the BBC World Service. For more news and analysis, download Business Matters, our daily hour-long mix of current affairs and debate, published at breakfast time in Asia and Europe. We debate key trends in the worlds of work, politics, technology and the environment. Find it at bbc.com/podcasts. You can also follow us and get our latest audio at twitter.com/BBC World Biz and talk to us on Facebook at facebook.com/BBC Business.
Commitment from the Ukrainian government to tackle corruption had helped make the agreement possible.
It's ambitious, it's not without risk, but we believe that it's a realistic set of macroeconomic framework first and ambitious reforms, but reforms that the authorities feel confident they can deliver. Well, clearly the Ukrainian authorities are demonstrating a determination and a courage to reform like we had never seen.
Christine Lagarde. The point of the loan is to stabilise Ukraine's economy, restore growth and improve living standards. It won't mean an awful lot, though, if the ceasefire due to take effect on Sunday doesn't hold. Foreign investors have caused property prices to soar in some of the world's biggest cities.
I'm in the middle of central London, and it's like living in the country sometimes. All you can hear are the birds in the square. But from a safety point of view, if a burglary was taking place, there'd be no one there to observe it.
Plus, the row over in-flight nuts, which led to a jail sentence and raises new questions over South Korea's powerful family-run firms. Is this the turning point for Ukraine, battered for so long by violence and economic crisis? International leaders have signed a ceasefire agreement with pro-Russian rebels in the east, and the International Monetary Fund has announced a $40 billion rescue package for Ukraine to be spread over 4 years. IMF chief Christine Lagarde told reporters that Ukrainian ceasefires don't have a great track record when it comes to permanence. I asked the Kiev-based economist Vladimir Dubrovsky how important he thought the IMF loan was for his country.
I think it is vitally important in both purely economic sense and in political sense, because in economic sense it is important because Ukraine is running out of money and the Ukrainian government desperately needs something to support itself. This is a war in our country. The country lost a substantial portion of its industrial potential. And also, to make the things worse, one of the main commodities the Ukraine used to export, the ferrous metals and ferrous ore, is now much cheaper than it used to be a year ago. So Ukraine lost a lot of exports, and therefore it needs some more currency to support its national currency. And also the government cannot collect as much taxes as it used to. At the same time, we cannot substantially cut the social benefits because it would create a riot. So I think this loan is vitally important economically. It is also vitally important politically because it will press on the Ukrainian government, make him to push the reforms.
Yes, he did say, the Ukrainian Prime Minister did sound a note of caution, didn't he, in response to this loan. This is Mike Johnson with the Download edition of World Business Report for Thursday, February the 12th. Ukraine gets a roadmap to peace and a multi-billion-dollar international loan.
We are not a third world country. This will be a real economic miracle if Ukraine will manage to establish a peace and implement the necessary reforms.
We'll ask if Ukraine really has turned a corner. Also today, as the clocks tick down to the day when Greece runs out of money, what that might mean for the Greek people.
I don't have money on the bank. More people doesn't have than they have, but the people who have now be taking out, because the new government said, okay, if you have so much money and you are rich, you will pay.
How multi-billionaire foreign